My sister does some genetic modification work on the side. It's interesting for a hobby, but hardly scalable. The crowd of 400 agricultural industry leaders laughed politely at my brother's dismissive joke. I sat in the back row, wearing jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, watching Nathan Carter bask in the spotlight on stage at the Global Agricultural Innovation Summit in Chicago. What Nathan didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except me, was that my hobby had just been deployed across 2.3 million acres in East Africa and was currently preventing what the United Nations had projected would be the worst famine in 40 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Nathan and I grew up on a corn farm in central Iowa. Our father ran 600 acres of conventional crops, and from the time we could walk, he had us both working the fields. Nathan loved the business side, commodity prices, equipment purchases, land acquisition. I loved the science. While he was calculating profit margins, I was collecting soil samples and reading genetics textbooks I'd checked out from the county library. When I got a full scholarship to study plant genetics at Cornell, Dad was proud. Nathan was skeptical. Book learning doesn't grow crops, he'd say. Real farming happens in the field, not in some laboratory. After Cornell, I did my PhD at UC Davis, focusing on drought-resistant crop variants. My dissertation research identified a gene sequence that could help plants survive with 60% less water than traditional varieties. My committee called it potentially revolutionary. Nathan called it playing with plants. Meanwhile, Nathan took over Dad's farm and expanded it aggressively. He bought out neighboring properties, invested in corporate partnerships, and positioned himself as a thought leader in industrial agriculture. By 35, he was running 12,000 acres and speaking at conferences like this one, wearing expensive suits and talking about scalable solutions and market-driven innovation. I took a different path. After my PhD, I turned down offers from Monsanto and DuPont to start my own research foundation, Carter Agricultural Research Initiative, funded initially by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our mission wasn't profit. It was solving the hardest problems in global food security, starting with the crops that couldn't survive climate change. For 8 years, I worked out of a modest lab in Davis, California. No fancy offices, no PR team, no industry conferences. Just me, a team of 12 brilliant scientists, and a singular focus: creating crop variants that could grow in conditions where nothing else would survive. 3 years ago, we had our breakthrough. A sorghum variant that could produce full yields with minimal rainfall, resistant to the specific soil conditions found across the Sahel region of Africa. We called it Miranda, 7, because it was the 7th iteration that finally worked. My team insisted on naming it after me. I tried to talk them out of it. The testing took 2 more years. Field trials in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Chad. Partnerships with local agricultural ministries. Training programs for farmers who'd never worked with modified seeds before. It was slow, painstaking work that would never make headlines or generate shareholder returns. 6 months ago, we began full deployment. The timing was critical. Climate models showed a severe drought approaching, the kind that historically triggered mass starvation. Traditional crops would fail. Miranda, 7 wouldn't. My family had no idea. I'd stopped trying to explain my work to them years ago. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, Nathan would dominate the conversation with stories about his latest land purchase or equipment upgrade, and Dad would beam with pride. When anyone asked about my work, I'd say research and change the subject. It was easier than watching their eyes glaze over, or worse, hearing Nathan's condescending "that's nice." I almost didn't come to this conference. Nathan had sent me an invitation months ago, not because he wanted me there, but because he wanted the family represented in the audience during his keynote speech. It would look good, he'd said. Shows we're a real farming family. So here I was, sitting in the back row while my brother stood on stage, accepting applause for his presentation on corporate strategies for sustainable agricultural growth. His slides were polished, his delivery smooth, his message exactly what this audience of agribusiness executives wanted to hear. Innovation through investment, growth through acquisition, sustainability through profitability. The Q&A session had started predictably enough. Softball questions about market trends and equipment costs. Then someone asked about genetic modification, and Nathan launched into his rehearsed response about responsible innovation and market-tested solutions. That's when he made his joke about me. My sister does some genetic modification work on the side. It's interesting for a hobby, but hardly scalable. Real agricultural innovation happens at the industry level, not in academic laboratories. The crowd laughed. I sank a little lower in my seat. Then a woman stood up in the middle section. She was tall, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made the room go quiet. I recognized her immediately, Dr. Amara Okonkwo, Director of Food Security Programs for the United Nations World Food Program. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Did you say your sister works in genetic modification? Is your sister Miranda Carter?" Nathan blinked. "Yes, that's her. She runs a small research operation in California." "Why do you ask?" Dr. Okonkwo turned to face the audience. "I'd like to share some information that I suspect Mr. Carter isn't aware of." She pulled out her phone and began reading from the screen. 3 weeks ago, the Carter Agricultural Research Initiative completed deployment of the Miranda 7 sorghum variant across 2.3 million acres in Sudan, South Sudan, and Chad. The murmuring started immediately. Nathan's smile froze on his face. "This deployment," Dr. Okonkwo continued, "is currently preventing what our models projected would be a humanitarian crisis affecting over 5 million people. The Miranda 7 variant can produce viable yields with 60% less water than traditional sorghum. In the drought conditions we're seeing this season, traditional crops have failed entirely. Miranda 7 is thriving." She looked directly at Nathan. "Ms. Carter's work will feed approximately 3.2 million people over the next 2 years. Her contribution to global food security is worth more than every corporate farming operation in this room combined." The conference erupted. People were turning in their seats, looking around, trying to find me. Nathan stood frozen at the podium, his carefully crafted presentation completely forgotten. "Is Ms. Carter here?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. I was told she might be attending. For a moment, I considered staying silent. I hadn't come here for recognition. I'd come because Nathan asked me to, because despite everything, he was still my brother. But then I thought about my team back in Davis, the farmers in Sudan who'd trusted us with their livelihoods, the children who would eat this year because of work we'd done in obscurity for nearly a decade. I stood up. 400 heads turned toward the back of the room. Toward me, in my jeans and faded Cornell sweatshirt, looking nothing like the polished executives surrounding me. "That's me," I said quietly. Dr. Okonkwo smiled. "Ms. Carter, on behalf of the World Food Program, I'd like to formally thank you for your partnership. Your work is saving lives. We'd be honored if you'd join me on stage to discuss the Miranda 7 project." The applause started slowly, then built into something thunderous. People were standing, not for Nathan's corporate presentation, but for the hobby he'd dismissed 5 minutes ago. I walked down the aisle toward the stage, passing rows of agricultural executives who were now looking at me with completely different expressions than they'd had when I'd walked in. When I reached the front, Nathan was still standing at the podium, microphone in hand, face completely blank. "Nathan," I said quietly as I passed him. "Move." He stepped aside without a word. Dr. Okonkwo shook my hand warmly. "I apologize for ambushing you. When I saw the conference program and realized the keynote speaker shared your last name, I couldn't resist. Your brother seemed very confident about the limitations of laboratory research." "He usually is," I said. For the next 40 minutes, I answered questions about Miranda 7, about our research process, about the deployment challenges and the partnerships that made it possible. I talked about the farmers I'd met in Ethiopia who had cried when they saw their first successful harvest with our seeds. I talked about the 12 scientists on my team who had worked for 8 years on a project that would never make them rich but might help feed a continent. When I finally stepped off stage, Nathan was waiting in the wings. His face had gone through several colors during my impromptu presentation, white, red, and finally settling on something like gray. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I looked at my brother, the golden child, the successful one, the one who'd inherited Dad's farm and Dad's approval and never once questioned whether he deserved either. "I tried," I said. "For years I tried. Every time I mentioned my research, you called it playing with plants. Every time I talked about our field trials, you changed the subject to your equipment purchases. Every time I said we were close to a breakthrough, you reminded me that real farming happens in the field, not in laboratories. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. I kept my voice calm. It was easier to believe your sister was wasting her life on impractical science than to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was more than one way to contribute to agriculture. Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but we were interrupted by a stream of conference attendees wanting to talk to me. Business cards were pressed into my hands. Partnership proposals were mentioned. 3 people asked if I'd consider speaking at their events. Through it all, Nathan stood off to the side watching. His keynote had been completely overshadowed. His moment in the spotlight had become mine. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached me again. "I owe you an apology." "Yes," I agreed. "You do." "I'm sorry, Miranda. I'm sorry for every dismissive comment, every condescending joke. I was wrong." I studied his face. The apology seemed genuine, which was more than I'd expected. "Thank you for saying that. What happens now?" "Now I go back to California and keep working. We're already developing variants for rice and wheat. Climate change isn't slowing down, which means neither can we." I paused. "And you go back to Iowa and run your farm. We do different things, Nathan. That doesn't make either one less valuable." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I could visit your lab sometime. See what you're working on." "I'd like that." As I walked out of the convention center, my phone was already buzzing with messages. From my team, from foundation partners, from journalists who'd somehow gotten my number. The story of the Carter siblings was apparently too good to resist. I ignored them all and called my lab instead. Miranda, my lead researcher, Dr. James Holloway, answered on the first ring. "Someone just sent me a video from that conference. Is it true? Did your brother really call your work a hobby in front of 400 people? And then the UN director stood up and... She did. I couldn't help smiling. It was quite a moment. The team is celebrating. Someone brought champagne. Save me a glass. I'll be back tomorrow." I paused. "And James? Thank you. All of you. None of this happens without the team." I hung up and looked out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere across the ocean, in villages I would probably never visit, farmers were harvesting crops that shouldn't have been possible. Children were eating meals that climate models said they wouldn't have. My brother had called it a hobby. The United Nations had called it a breakthrough. I called it the reason I got up every morning. And tomorrow, I would go back to my modest lab in Davis, California, and start working on the next impossible problem. Not for recognition, not for profit, not to prove anything to Nathan or anyone else. Just because somewhere in the world, there were people who needed crops that could survive conditions nothing else could. And I knew how to make them grow. That night, back at my hotel, I got one more call. It was Dad. "Nathan told me what happened," he said, his voice gruff the way it always got when he was emotional. "He said some woman from the United Nations got up and talked about your work. Said you're feeding millions of people." "Something like that, Dad." There was a long pause. "Why didn't you ever tell me? All those years, I thought you were just, I don't know, doing experiments. Nothing practical." "I tried, Dad. But you and Nathan always seemed more interested in bushels per acre than gene sequences. I figured you wouldn't understand." Another pause. "I understand that my daughter is helping feed 3 million people. That's something any farmer would be proud of." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm proud of you, Miranda. I should have said it years ago." I felt tears prick at my eyes. In 36 years, I could count on one hand the number of times my father had said those words to me. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. You come home for Thanksgiving this year, you hear? And bring some of those scientists of yours. I want to hear everything." "I will." After we hung up, I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, my brother was probably still processing what had happened. His keynote speech would be forgotten by tomorrow. My hobby would be discussed for months. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was a little girl in Sudan who would have breakfast tomorrow because of seeds we'd developed in a modest lab in California. What mattered was a farmer in Chad who could feed his family through a drought that should have destroyed everything. What mattered was the next problem, and the one after that, and all the impossible challenges waiting to be solved. Nathan had built an empire of 12,000 acres. I had helped feed a continent. Turns out there's more than one way to be a farmer after all.